My name is Beatrice. I am 73 years old, and what I did to my husband and my daughter-in-law might sound cruel to some. But if you had seen what I saw, you would have done exactly the same thing. Just last week, I used my own son's smart home technology to lock my husband Arthur and his mistress Serafina inside a soundproof room. I watched on a security camera as the police battered down the door. I watched as the officers dragged them out in handcuffs, exposing their sick, twisted secret to the world. For months, they thought I was just a fading old woman, blind to their betrayal. They thought they could steal my son's life's work right from under his nose while he was halfway across the world. But they forgot one thing about me. I used to be an interior designer, and a damn good one. I know how to spot a crack in the foundation long before the house collapses. And I know exactly how to bring the walls down on top of the people who deserve it. Before we dive into this nightmare, please subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. And after you hear my story, I need to know if you think I went too far. To understand why I had to destroy my own family, you have to understand what we built together. My son Leo is a brilliant architect who forged his talent through decades of dedication and hard work. I remember when he was just 7 years old, sitting at my old drafting table while I worked late into the night. Back then, I was still building my career as an interior designer, taking on projects that kept me busy until dawn. Leo would sit beside me, drawing on the back of my old blueprints with his stubby crayons. One evening, he tugged at my sleeve and held up his paper with both hands. It was a sketch of a building, crooked and childish, but unmistakably a skyscraper with dozens of tiny windows. "Mom," he said, his eyes shining with that pure joy only children possess. "One day, I'm going to build a house that thinks for itself." I laughed and kissed his forehead, smelling the baby shampoo still lingering in his hair. "Then you'll have to study very hard," I told him. "I will," he promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his small being. And he did. Leo grew up to build a magnificent modern home that also served as his architectural design studio. It was a masterpiece of glass, steel, and cutting-edge technology that made visitors gasp when they first saw it. Everything in that house was controlled by voice commands, fingerprint recognition, and smartphone apps. It was his sanctuary, his workspace, and the physical proof of everything he had achieved. My husband Arthur and I lived in a cozy guest cottage on the same property, just a short walk from the main house. It seemed like the perfect arrangement for our golden years, close to family, but with our own private space. Arthur was a retired construction manager, a man who once commanded respect with his silver hair and firm handshake. He had faced bankruptcy 15 years ago, a failure that had bruised his pride more than he ever admitted to anyone. I remember how he changed after that, how the shame settled into his bones like a permanent ache. But outwardly, he seemed proud of Leo and content to bask in our son's growing success. Or so I thought at the time. Looking back now, I can see the hunger that was always there, hiding behind his eyes. Then there was Serafina, my daughter-in-law. She was 38, beautiful with sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She seemed utterly devoted to my son, always touching his arm, always laughing at his jokes. Serafina managed the business side of Leo's architectural firm with impressive efficiency. She handled the contracts, the finances, the client relationships, all the things that Leo found tedious. "You're so lucky, Mom," Leo would tell me during our Sunday dinners together. "Serafina takes care of everything, so I can just focus on creating." I would smile and nod, watching her pour wine for Arthur across the table. I watched them laugh at shared jokes that seemed to exclude the rest of us somehow. But I told myself I was seeing a happy family, a father proud of his son, a wife supporting her husband. How foolish I was in those days. I was looking at the surface, admiring the fresh paint, never suspecting the rot eating away at the beams underneath. I need to tell you something about my marriage that I have never told anyone before. Arthur was not always the cold, calculating man who betrayed our son. There was a time, decades ago, when he made my heart race with just a smile. I remember our first winter together, in that tiny apartment with the radiator that never worked properly. Arthur came home from work one evening, his coat dusted with snow, his hands red from the cold. He stood in the doorway, stamping his boots, and then he smiled at me with such tenderness. "Beatrice," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I found this on the way home." He held out a small wildflower, half frozen, its stem already starting to wilt. I took it from his cold fingers, confused. A flower? In winter? It was growing through a crack in the sidewalk, he said. "Stubborn little thing. Bloomin' when it shouldn't. Made me think of you." I laughed and called him a fool, but I put that flower in a jam jar on our windowsill. It died by morning, of course, but Arthur had seen it and thought of me. That meant something once. That man, the one who found flowers in the snow, where did he go? When did the tenderness curdle into resentment? I spent 47 years asking myself that question, and I still don't have a good answer. The beginning of the end started on a Tuesday morning in late October. The leaves were turning golden, and the air had that crisp bite that signals winter approaching. Leo had landed the biggest contract of his entire career, a massive development project in Dubai. It would keep him overseas for at least 3 months, maybe longer if the client requested changes. The atmosphere in the house was electric with excitement that day. I went over to the main house to help Leo pack for his trip. He was running around his bedroom like a whirlwind, throwing blueprints into cardboard tubes and checking his tablet. Serafina was there too, folding his shirts with the precision of a military officer. "I'm going to miss you so much, darling," she said, kissing him on the cheek. Her voice dripped with affection, sweet as honey poured from a jar. "But don't you worry about the studio. Arthur and I will hold down the fort while you're gone." I noticed Arthur standing by the window, looking out at the property with a strange expression. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had a hungry gleam that I mistook for fatherly pride at the time. "We'll take care of everything, son," Arthur said, clapping Leo firmly on the shoulder. "You just focus on the project. Leave the business here to us." Leo smiled, that trusting, innocent smile that always made him look like a boy to me. He turned to me then, holding up his phone with the security app displayed on the screen. "Mom, before I go, I want to do something important." He tapped on his screen and my phone buzzed in my cardigan pocket. "I just granted you full administrator access to the house and studio security system." I looked at him, genuinely confused by this gesture. "Leo, I don't need this. Serafina handles all the house systems." Leo shook his head, his expression turning serious in a way that caught my attention. "I know, Mom. But you're the one who taught me about safety and paying attention to details." He took my hands in his, and I noticed how large they had grown, how capable. Technology can glitch. Serafina gets busy with work. "I want to know that you can always get in if there's an emergency. Think of it as a backup key. But digital," he added with a small smile. I looked at the app on my phone, marveling at the interface. It showed the status of every door, every window, every camera in real time. "Okay, Leo," I said, hugging him tightly against my chest. "I'll keep an eye on things while you're away." If I had known then that this digital key would become my weapon, I would have held him even tighter. I would have told him I loved him one more time, just in case. I watched his taxi pull away down the long gravel driveway, disappearing behind the oak trees. Serafina waved until the car was completely out of sight, her smile fixed in place like a mask. Then something shifted in the air. She turned to Arthur, and the sweetness vanished from her face like morning fog burned away by sun. Her expression became cold, businesslike, efficient. "Well," she said, smoothing her expensive silk skirt, "he's gone." There was something in her tone that made the hairs on my arms stand up. A sudden drop in temperature that only I seemed to notice. "I have a lot of work to do in the studio," she continued, not even glancing in my direction. "Arthur, can you help me move some boxes later this afternoon?" "Of course," my husband replied, and his voice was a little too eager, a little too warm. I brushed off the feeling, telling myself I was being ridiculous. I was just an overprotective mother, anxious about her son leaving for 3 months. I walked back to my cottage alone, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and tried to settle into my new routine. But that night, I couldn't shake the image of Serafina's face when she turned away from the taxi. The way the mask had slipped, just for a moment, the way Arthur had looked at her, like a dog waiting for permission. 2 weeks passed without any major incidents. Leo called every other day from Dubai, his voice tired but crackling with excitement about the project. "The clients love the initial designs, Mom," he told me during one call. "This could really put the firm on the international map." I told him I was proud of him, that his father and I were taking care of everything back home. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but what else could I say? That I was watching his father and wife like a hawk, looking for evidence of something I couldn't name. Serafina was indeed busy in the studio, often working late into the night. The lights would burn in those big glass windows until well past midnight. Arthur spent a lot of time over there, supposedly helping her with administrative tasks. "She needs advice on the structural contracts," Arthur told me over dinner one evening. "She's completely overwhelmed, Beatrice. I'm just doing my part to help the family." I nodded and stirred my soup, watching his face for any sign of deception. "It's good of you, Arthur. Leo appreciates having you there." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did anymore, not when he looked at me. The unease in my gut was growing day by day, though I tried to ignore it. It wasn't a loud alarm, just a quiet and persistent hum that wouldn't let me rest. I started noticing small things that I had overlooked before. The way Serafina had started calling Arthur by his first name instead of Dad or Father. The way they would stop talking when I entered a room, their conversations dying mid-sentence. The private smiles they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. One afternoon, I saw them walking back from the studio together through my kitchen window. Serafina's hand brushed against Arthur's arm, and he leaned toward her slightly. It was nothing, really. Just a moment between two people walking side by side. But something about it made my stomach turn. I told myself I was being paranoid, a jealous old woman imagining things that weren't there. Arthur had accused me of that before, countless times over the years. "You always do this, Beatrice," he would say whenever I questioned him. "You imagine things. You make problems where there are none." Maybe he was right. Maybe 47 years of marriage had made me suspicious of my own shadow. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew something was very wrong. The first real crack appeared 3 days later. I was doing some deep cleaning in Arthur's study inside our cottage. He had always been messy with his paperwork, an old habit from his construction management days. Stacks of magazines, old invoices, and unopened mail covered every surface like paper snowdrifts. I was dusting his mahogany desk, moving piles of clutter to wipe underneath. That's when a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor like a falling leaf. It had slipped out of the pocket of his gray blazer, which was draped carelessly over the chair. I bent down to pick it up, my knees protesting the movement. It was a receipt from a high-end boutique in the city, a place I hadn't visited in over a decade. My eyes scanned the items listed on the thin paper. Perfume, L'Ombre de la Nuit, $185. Silk scarf, emerald green, $395. The total was nearly $600, charged to Arthur's personal credit card. I stood there, frozen, holding that receipt like it was a live grenade. My birthday was still 5 months away. Our anniversary had already passed in June, with nothing more than a card and a quiet dinner. Arthur had never been one for random acts of romance, certainly not $600 worth. Maybe it was for me, I told myself. A surprise, perhaps, for our upcoming trip to visit my sister Margaret. I wanted to believe it was innocent. I wanted to believe my husband of nearly 5 decades was planning something sweet. But the name of that perfume stuck in my mind like a thorn. L'ombre de la nuit. Shadow of the night. It sounded heavy, seductive. Nothing like the light floral scents I had worn for 40 years. I put the receipt back on the desk, my hands trembling slightly. I would wait. I would watch. And if I was wrong, I would never mention it to anyone. 2 days later, Serafina invited us to dinner at the main house. To celebrate the first milestone of Leo's project, she announced over the phone. Her voice was bright and cheerful, the perfect daughter-in-law. I dressed carefully that evening, trying to shake off the suspicion that had been clouding my mind. I chose my nicest blouse and the pearl earrings Arthur had given me for our 20th anniversary. Arthur was in a particularly good mood, humming to himself as he shaved in the bathroom mirror. "You look nice, Beatrice," he said when I walked past the doorway. But his eyes didn't really see me. They were looking past me, toward the main house where Serafina was waiting. When we arrived at 7 o'clock, Serafina greeted us at the front door. She was wearing a stunning black dress that hugged her figure like it was painted on. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her smile welcoming, and around her neck, draped with casual elegance, was an emerald green silk scarf. I stopped in the doorway, my hand gripping the frame so hard my knuckles went white. It was the scarf. The same brand, the same color, the exact shade of green as the one listed on that receipt. "Beatrice, are you okay?" Serafina asked, tilting her head with false concern. And then it hit me. The scent. A wave of heavy, musky perfume washed over me as she leaned in to kiss my cheek. It wasn't her usual light citrus fragrance, the one that reminded me of summer lemons. This was dark, spicy, overpowering, clinging to her skin like a second layer. It was the shadow of the night. My husband's $600 gift displayed on another woman's body. My stomach lurched violently, and I felt the room spin around me. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet like the deck of a ship in a storm. I looked at Arthur, desperate for some other explanation, some innocent reason. But he was staring at Serafina with an expression I hadn't seen in decades. It was hunger, pure and undisguised. It was the way he used to look at me when we were young and foolish and in love. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though my voice sounded like it was coming from miles away. "Just a little dizzy. I need to sit down for a moment." Dinner that night was a special kind of torture that I wouldn't wish on anyone. I sat at my son's table, eating food prepared in my son's kitchen, watching my husband seduce my son's wife. They thought they were being subtle about it, and maybe they were. Maybe to anyone else, it would have looked like simple family warmth and affection. But I had spent nearly 50 years studying Arthur's body language, learning his tells. I saw the way his fingers lingered when Serafina passed him the bread basket, the way he leaned in too close when pouring her wine, inhaling her scent like a drug, the way their feet touched under the table, hidden by the white linen tablecloth. And Serafina? She was enjoying every moment of it. She would glance at Arthur with those sharp eyes, then look away with a tiny, secret smile. She touched the silk scarf around her neck constantly, as if reminding herself of his gift. It was a performance, I realized, with growing horror. They were performing normalcy while carrying on an affair right in front of my face. They thought the old woman across the table was blind, deaf, and stupid. They forgot that I had spent my entire career observing spaces and the people within them. An interior designer doesn't just arrange furniture. She reads how people move and interact. I noticed the tension crackling between them like static electricity before a storm. But I didn't say a word. I cut my steak. I drank my water. I smiled when it seemed appropriate. Because a voice inside me, a cold and calculating voice I hadn't heard in years, whispered a warning. Wait. Watch. Gather your evidence. Be absolutely certain before you strike. That night, I lay in bed next to Arthur, listening to his peaceful snoring. Every breath he took sounded like Ali. Every exhale, a betrayal. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, my mind racing with terrible possibilities. This wasn't just about sex, I realized, as the hours crept toward dawn. It wasn't just about an old man chasing youth or a young woman seeking excitement. There was something calculated about the way Serafina had positioned herself. She managed all of Leo's finances. She had access to all of his accounts, his contracts, his business records. And now she had Arthur, a man bitter about his own failures and hungry for what he felt he deserved. What were they really planning in that studio during those late nights? What were they celebrating with champagne while my son worked himself to exhaustion overseas? The betrayal wasn't just personal. I suddenly understood. It was strategic, and that made it infinitely more dangerous. The next morning, Arthur announced he was going to the hardware store. "Need to pick up some supplies for the studio repairs," he said, pulling on his jacket. He didn't meet my eyes as he said it, which told me everything I needed to know. "Drive safe," I called out as he headed for the door. As soon as his truck pulled out of the driveway, I went into action. I didn't go to the main house. Not yet. That would have been too obvious. Too easy for them to explain away. Instead, I went straight to his computer in the study, the one he thought I didn't know how to use. Arthur wasn't a technology genius, but he knew enough to password protect his laptop. However, he was also an arrogant man who thought he was smarter than everyone else around him. He kept all his passwords written in a small leather address book in the top desk drawer. I found it easily, right where it had been for the past 15 years. I flipped to the page marked Computer, and there it was, written in his cramped handwriting. Password 123. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The man was planning some kind of scheme, and his security was a joke a child could crack. I typed it in with trembling fingers, and the screen unlocked immediately. I wasn't looking for love letters or romantic messages. Arthur and Serafina were too practical, too calculating for such sentimental evidence. I was looking for plans, documents, anything that showed what they were really doing. I opened his email and scanned through his inbox carefully. Nothing suspicious there, just newsletters about fishing equipment and retirement planning. But then I remembered something my grandson had taught me years ago. "Check the drafts folder," he had said. People use drafts to communicate without leaving a trail in their sent messages. I clicked on the drafts folder, my heart pounding against my ribs. There was one email, saved but never sent, sitting there like a confession. Subject line: Transfer Protocols. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. It was addressed to a lawyer I had never heard of, someone from a firm in the next state over. The message read, "We have the initial drafts ready. S is working on the signature match. We need to move the assets before he returns in December. Confirm the shell company registration status." I read it again, then a third time, making sure I understood what I was seeing. Signature match. Move the assets. Shell company. This wasn't just an affair. This was a heist. They weren't just sleeping together behind my son's back. They were plotting to steal everything he had ever built. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the mouse. I needed more information, more proof of what they were planning. That's when I remembered the app on my phone, the gift Leo had given me before leaving. Administrator access to every camera, every lock, every system in the house and studio. I pulled out my phone and opened the security app with trembling fingers. The interface showed live feeds from all the cameras on the property. The living room of the main house was empty. The kitchen was empty. The front porch showed nothing but autumn leaves blowing across the steps. I switched to the studio camera, and my breath caught in my throat. Serafina was there, but she wasn't working on architectural plans. She was sitting at Leo's main workstation, surrounded by stacks of official-looking documents. In her hand was a pen, and she was practicing something on a blank sheet of paper. Over and over again, the same emotion, the same careful strokes. I zoomed in as much as the high-definition feed would allow. She was practicing Leo's signature. My son's name, written in her handwriting, again and again, trying to match his style. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped animal desperate to escape. She was forging his signature to steal his company. Just then, the front door of the studio opened on the video feed. Arthur walked in, and I realized he had never gone to any hardware store. He must have parked his truck down the road and walked back to meet her in secret. I watched on the tiny screen as he approached her from behind. He placed his hands on her shoulders, kneading them possessively like he owned her. She leaned her head back against his stomach and closed her eyes with a satisfied smile. He bent down and kissed her neck, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a kiss of passion or affection. It was a kiss of ownership, of partnership in crime. Then he straightened up and looked at the papers spread across the desk. "How's it coming?" I couldn't hear audio, but I could read his lips clearly. She held up the practice sheet, showing him her progress with Leo's signature. He nodded, a grin spreading across his weathered face like a crack in old plaster. A grin of pure, undisguised malice. He picked up a thick document from the desk and waved it triumphantly in the air. Even from the camera feed, I could tell what it was. A power of attorney form, ready for a forged signature. I sat back in Arthur's chair, the silence of the study pressing against my ears. I finally understood the full scale of their plan. They were going to use a forged power of attorney to transfer ownership of everything Leo had built. The studio, the patents, the client contracts, the bank accounts. They would create a shell company and move all the assets into their control. When Leo returned from Dubai, he would find himself locked out of his own life. They would claim he had signed everything over willingly. Who would believe him over his own father and wife? I felt a single tear roll down my cheek. But I wasn't crying for my marriage. That was already dead and buried. I was crying for my son, my beautiful, trusting boy, who was working himself to exhaustion for a family that was actively destroying him. I wiped the tear away with the back of my hand, feeling something cold settle in my chest. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. I wasn't going to be the sad old woman who discovers the truth and cries in the corner. I was Beatrice, and I had spent 40 years designing spaces that shaped how people lived. Now I was going to design a trap that would end 2 careers in crime. I looked at the phone in my hand, at the app that gave me control over everything. Smart locks, motion sensors, sound system, steel shutters, signal jammer. I had control of the entire building. A plan began to form in my mind, cold and precise as an architectural blueprint. I didn't just want to stop them. I wanted to expose them completely. I wanted to crush them so thoroughly they could never recover. I wanted Leo to see them for exactly what they were, without any shadow of doubt. I needed concrete evidence that would hold up in court. I needed the forged documents in police custody, and I needed to catch them in the act, in a way they could never explain or deny. That evening, I gave the performance of my life. When Arthur came home, smelling of Serafina's perfume and smug with satisfaction, I had dinner waiting on the table. I smiled at him like nothing was wrong, like I was still the trusting wife he thought I was. "Did you find what you needed at the hardware store?" I asked, pouring him a cup of tea. "Oh, yes," he said, taking a large bite of roast chicken. "Just some brackets and sealants. Boring stuff, really." Liar, I thought, watching him chew with his mouth half open. "You were kissing her neck while I was cooking your dinner." But I kept my face perfectly neutral, perfectly pleasant. "That's nice, dear. I'm glad you could help out." I let a moment pass, then launched the first part of my plan. "I was thinking, Arthur, I haven't seen my sister Margaret in such a long time." Arthur stopped chewing for just a fraction of a second. "Margaret? The one who lives in the city?" "Yes," I continued, keeping my voice light and casual. "She's been feeling under the weather lately, some issues with her hip." I sighed, playing the role of the concerned sister perfectly. "I was thinking of going to stay with her for the weekend. Leave Friday morning, come back Sunday night." I watched his face carefully, and I saw exactly what I expected. Relief. Opportunity. His eyes practically glittered with barely concealed excitement. If I was gone for the entire weekend, they would have the whole estate to themselves. No more sneaking around, no more pretending to work on contracts. They could spend 2 full days in the studio perfecting their forgeries, finalizing their theft, maybe celebrating their cleverness in my son's bed. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Beatrice," Arthur said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. His touch made my skin crawl, but I didn't flinch or pull away. "You deserve a break. Spend some quality time with your sister." "Yes," I said, returning his smile with one of my own. "I think a little time away is exactly what we all need." The trap was set, the bait taken. Now I just needed to prepare the cage. The next morning was Wednesday, and I had 3 days to finalize everything. I waited until Arthur was napping and Serafina was occupied with a video conference in the main house. Then I slipped out of the cottage and walked through the garden toward Leo's studio. I didn't go inside. That would have been too risky, too easy to leave traces. Instead, I walked slowly around the perimeter of the building, checking every security feature. The smart shutters were exactly as I remembered from when Leo had given me the tour. They were heavy, industrial-grade steel panels designed for maximum security and storm protection. Leo had installed them to protect his architectural prototypes and confidential client plans. When closed, they transformed the studio into an impenetrable fortress. Or, as I was now realizing, into a prison. I checked the Wi-Fi signal strength on my phone, walking to various spots around the building. It was strong everywhere, and my connection to the security hub remained perfectly stable. Everything was in place. I walked back to the cottage and made the first of my critical phone calls. I dialed the security company that monitored Leo's system, keeping my voice steady and professional. "Hello," I said, using my most authoritative tone. "This is Beatrice, Leo's mother. I should be listed as an authorized administrator." "Yes, ma'am, we have your credentials on file," the operator confirmed. "I'm updating our emergency response protocols while my son is overseas," I continued. "If the silent alarm is triggered this weekend, I want all notifications sent directly to my mobile phone. I also want the police contacted immediately for a level 1 break-in response." "Usually we call the home phone first to verify the alarm," the operator said hesitantly. "No," I cut him off firmly. "My son is out of the country. I will be away visiting family. The house should be empty." I let my voice tremble slightly, playing the worried mother. "If that alarm goes off, it means there is an intruder. A dangerous intruder stealing valuable prototypes. Do you understand?" "Understood, ma'am." "Immediate police dispatch. No verification call." "Good. Thank you for your help." I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Legally, I was well within my rights. I was the designated administrator, following the security protocol Leo had established. Protecting the studio from unauthorized access was exactly what my son had asked me to do. And technically, anyone forging documents to steal property was an intruder, regardless of their relationship to the owner. The law would be on my side. But I needed one more piece of this puzzle. The most painful piece of all. I needed Leo. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at his contact information on my phone. It was the middle of the night in Dubai, around 2 a.m. I shouldn't wake him when he was already exhausted from the project. But if I didn't warn him, he would lose everything. His business, his home, his savings, his future. And if he found out later that I had known and done nothing, I would lose him too. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. Then I pressed it and waited as the phone rang across thousands of miles. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Mom, is everything okay? It's the middle of the night here." I closed my eyes, feeling tears threaten to spill down my cheeks. "Leo, listen to me carefully," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I can't explain everything right now, but there is an emergency at the studio." I heard him sit up in bed, instantly alert. "What? A fire? Did a pipe burst? Is Dad okay?" "Worse than that," I said. "There is a serious security breach. Someone is trying to access your confidential files. What? Who would do that? I'm handling the situation from this end, but I need you to come home immediately. There was a pause, and I could hear him breathing, processing what I was telling him. Mom, I can't just leave. The clients are expecting a presentation next week. Leo, I said, more sharply than I intended. I am your mother. Have I ever asked you for anything like this before? Have I ever called you in the middle of the night with a false alarm? Silence on the line. No, he finally admitted. Never. If you don't come home immediately, there won't be a studio left to come back to. I let those words sink in, heavy with implication. Trust me, son. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't absolutely critical. I heard him exhale, a long breath of resignation and trust. Okay, Mom, I'll get the next available flight. I can be there in about 18 hours. Good. I'll pick you up at the airport myself. I hesitated, then added the final instruction. Leo, don't tell Serafina you're coming home. What? Why not? She's my wife. I chose my words very carefully, because the security breach might involve her network credentials. We don't know who is compromised. Just come home quietly. We'll figure everything out when you arrive. I hung up before he could ask more questions that I wasn't ready to answer. I hated lying to my son, even lies of omission. But the full truth would have destroyed him over the phone, alone in a hotel room thousands of miles away. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to see the forged signatures, the stolen documents, his wife in his father's arms. Only then would he truly be free of them. Friday morning arrived under a gray and threatening sky. Heavy clouds hung low over the property, and the air smelled like approaching rain. I packed my small suitcase carefully, making sure Arthur was watching me prepare to leave. Give Margaret my love, he said, loading my bag into the trunk of my car. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, barely able to contain his excitement. I will, I said, giving him a kiss on the cheek that meant nothing. Don't work too hard in the studio this weekend. He winked at me, and the gesture made my stomach turn. Just tidying up some loose ends, he said with a smile. Loose ends. That's what I was to him now, after 47 years of marriage. That's what Leo was. Just a loose end to be cut off so Arthur could steal the life he felt he deserved. I drove away down the gravel driveway, watching him in the rearview mirror. He waited until my car turned the corner before pulling out his phone, probably texting Serafina that the coast was finally clear. But I didn't go to Margaret's house. Instead, I drove to a quiet motel 2 towns over, about 20 minutes away from the property. I checked in under my own name and set up my command center on the small desk. My laptop, my phone, a pot of the strongest coffee the motel could provide. I connected to the security app and began my surveillance. The show was about to begin. At exactly 10 in the morning, Serafina entered the studio. She was carrying a bottle of expensive champagne and a thick stack of document folders. She walked straight to Leo's main drafting table and swept his sketches aside like they were garbage. His drawings, his creative work, brushed onto the floor without a second thought. At 10:15, Arthur arrived at the studio. I watched him lock the front door behind him, but he only engaged the simple handle lock. He didn't bother with the electronic deadbolt, the one that would have actually secured the building. Why would he? He thought they were completely alone, completely safe from discovery. He walked over to Serafina and spun her around to face him. They kissed deeply, laughing when they finally pulled apart. Arthur picked up the champagne bottle and popped the cork with a theatrical flourish. It hit the ceiling and bounced across the room. They poured 2 glasses and raised them high, toasting their own cleverness, toasting the successful theft of everything my son had ever built. I watched them drink Leo's expensive champagne, celebrating in his own studio. Then Arthur reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick document. The power of attorney, completed and ready for the forged signature. He slammed it down on the table with a triumphant grin. Serafina actually clapped her hands together in delight, like a child receiving a present. They spread the papers out across the table, pointing at various sections, nodding in agreement. I checked the flight tracker app on my phone. Leo's plane had landed an hour ago, right on schedule. He was currently in the Uber I had arranged, heading to a coffee shop near our property. I had told him to wait there until I could pick him up and explain everything. The timing had to be perfect. I needed them completely trapped before the police arrived. I needed them terrified and unable to escape or destroy evidence. And I needed my son to witness their exposure with his own eyes. I watched the security feed on my laptop, my finger hovering over the control panel. Inside the studio, Arthur and Serafina were pouring second glasses of champagne. They were laughing and kissing, utterly confident in their victory. It was 10:45 in the morning. I took a deep breath and thought about Leo's face the last time I had seen him. His trusting smile as he handed me administrator access. "Keep an eye on things, Mom. This is for you, son," I whispered to the empty motel room. Then I tapped the screen. "Initiate lockdown protocol, level 1. The reaction inside the studio was instantaneous and exactly as I had anticipated. Heavy steel shutters began descending over the floor-to-ceiling windows with a mechanical roar. The electronic deadbolts on every door engaged simultaneously with a loud metallic clack. The emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a harsh white glow. Inside the studio, the laughter died as suddenly, as if someone had cut a wire. Arthur dropped his champagne glass, and it shattered on the concrete floor in an explosion of crystal. The expensive wine spread across the floor like blood at a crime scene. What the hell? I could see him mouth, his face twisting with confusion and rising panic. He ran to the main door and grabbed the handle with both hands. It didn't move. He pulled harder, shaking it violently, throwing his entire weight against it. The electronic deadbolt held firm, designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. Serafina ran to the window, but the steel shutter had already sealed the view. She pounded her fists against the metal, but it was like hitting a tank. They were trapped, sealed inside a soundproof, steel-reinforced box of their own making. I watched the panic begin to take hold of them. Arthur was shouting now, his face aired with exertion and fear. He grabbed a chair and swung it at the window, but the shutter absorbed the impact without a dent. Serafina was pacing frantically, pulling out her phone with shaking hands. But I had planned for that too. Leo's studio had a built-in signal jammer, installed to prevent corporate espionage during sensitive client meetings. I had activated it remotely along with the lockdown. They had no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, no way to call for help. Now it was time for me to make my call. I dialed 911 with a trembling hand, preparing my voice for the performance. 911, what is your emergency? Please, you have to help me, I cried, making my voice shake with fear. I'm watching my security cameras. There are intruders trapped in my son's design studio. Ma'am, are you in a safe location? I'm out of town, but the security system activated and locked them inside. I injected pure panic into every word. They're destroying the place, trying to break out. They were stealing confidential documents. Please send someone immediately. We're dispatching units to your location now, ma'am. Can you confirm the address? I gave them the address, then added the final touch. Please hurry. I don't know who these people are or what they might do. I hung up and immediately drove to the coffee shop where Leo was waiting. When I pulled into the parking lot, Leo was standing on the curb with his suitcase. He looked exhausted from the overnight flight, dark circles under his eyes, his clothes wrinkled. But when he saw my car, he rushed over and climbed into the passenger seat. Mom, what is going on? He demanded as I sped away from the curb. You sounded terrified on the phone. Is Dad okay? Is Serafina hurt? I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I can't explain everything yet, but we have to get to the studio right now. The police are already on their way. Police? For a security glitch? I glanced at him, and my heart ached at the confusion in his eyes. It's not a glitch, Leo. Someone broke in, and the system trapped them inside. I don't want you to face this alone. I couldn't tell him more, not yet. He would find out everything soon enough, and the truth would shatter him. I wanted to be there to hold the pieces together. We turned onto our long private driveway just as two police cruisers sped past us in the opposite direction. Their sirens were wailing, red and blue lights flashing against the gray morning sky. Leo's face went pale as he watched them race toward his property. "That's the way to my studio," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is happening, Mom?" I didn't answer. I just pressed the accelerator harder and followed the police cars up the hill. The scene at the studio was controlled chaos when we arrived. 4 police officers had taken positions around the building, using their patrol cars as cover. Their weapons were drawn, pointed at the sealed steel door. "Come out with your hands up," an officer shouted through a bullhorn. "This is the police. We have the building surrounded. Open this door now." Leo was out of the car before I could stop him, running toward the police line. "That's my studio," he yelled, waving his arms. "I'm the owner. I'm Leo Vance. What the hell is happening here?" A sergeant intercepted him before he could get too close. "Stay back, sir. We have reports of multiple intruders trapped inside. They triggered the security system. They might be armed and dangerous." Leo looked at the sealed building, then back at me as I approached. "Intruders? Mom, who is in there?" I walked up beside him and stood tall, meeting his bewildered gaze. "I don't know for certain," I said, the lie coming easily now. "But I locked them in when I saw what they were doing on the security cameras." I reached out and took his hand, squeezing it firmly. "You need to open the door, Leo. Use your master key. Let's find out who is trying to steal your life's work." Leo stared at me for a long moment, searching my face for answers I wasn't ready to give. Then he nodded, his jaw setting with determination. He pulled out the physical master key that overrode all electronic locks, the one he always carried. "Cover him!" the sergeant shouted to his officers. They adjusted their positions, training their weapons on the door. Leo approached the entrance, his hand steady despite everything. He inserted the key into the manual override slot and turned it firmly. The heavy lock clicked open with a sound like a final verdict. The police kicked the door wide open, flooding the interior with natural light. "Police, get on the ground, now!" Leo and I stood behind the wall of officers, peering into the dim interior of the studio. And there they were. Arthur and Serafina stood frozen in the center of the room, like criminals caught in a spotlight. The scene before us was absolutely damning. Broken glass from the shattered champagne scattered across the floor. Serafina's expensive dress disheveled from her panicked attempts to escape. Her hair was wild, her makeup smeared, her composure completely destroyed. And on the drafting table, clearly visible under the harsh tactical flashlights, were piles of documents. Legal papers, signature practice sheets, the power of attorney in its official folder. "Dad?" Leo's voice was barely a whisper, cracking on that single word. "Serafina?" The silence that followed was heavier than the steel shutters that had imprisoned them. The police officers lowered their weapons slightly, confused by the obvious recognition. This wasn't a stranger breaking and entering. This was something far worse, far more personal. Serafina recovered first, attempting to compose her shattered dignity. "Leo, thank God you're here," she cried, her voice high with false relief. The security system went completely crazy. We were just checking on some paperwork and everything locked down. We've been trapped for hours. It was terrifying. But her lies couldn't hide the truth that was spread across the table behind her. Leo walked slowly into the room, ignoring the police warnings to stay back. He walked past his father, who couldn't even lift his eyes from the floor. He walked straight to his drafting table, to the documents that would destroy his marriage. He picked up the paper sitting on top of the pile, the one Arthur had been waving triumphantly just an hour ago. "Asset transfer agreement," Leo read aloud, his voice trembling. "Transfer of all intellectual property and real estate holdings to AS Holdings LLC?" He looked up at Serafina, and I saw the moment everything clicked into place. AS Holdings? Arthur and Serafina? Serafina rushed forward, grabbing his arm with desperate fingers. "No, Leo, listen to me. We were doing this to protect you, for tax purposes." It was going to be a surprise. A way to shelter your assets from liability. Leo pulled his arm away from her like her touch burned his skin. He picked up another piece of paper from the table, one I recognized from the security footage. It was the practice sheet, covered with Serafina's attempts to forge his signature. Dozens of versions of Leo Vance written in her careful handwriting, each one closer to his real signature than the last. "To protect me?" Leo asked, holding up the damning evidence. "By forging my signature? By creating fake documents to transfer my company to yourselves?" His voice rose with each word, years of trust collapsing in a single moment. He turned to face Arthur, who still stood with his head bowed like a convicted man. "And you," Leo said, and his voice cracked completely. "You're my father. You were supposed to protect me, to guide me. I looked up to you my entire life." Arthur finally raised his head, and I saw no remorse in his weathered face. Only the bitter, toxic anger of a man whose scheme had been exposed. "You have too much, Leo." Arthur spat, the words venomous. "You have the talent, the money, the beautiful young wife, the success." His voice grew louder with each accusation. "I built this family. I worked 60-hour weeks while you were drawing pictures. I was the one who sacrificed everything, and what do I have to show for it? A cottage on your property? I deserved a share of what you have. I deserved recognition." I watched my husband of 47 years reveal himself completely. All the bitterness, all the jealousy, all the entitlement he had hidden behind a smile. But he wasn't finished. "And Serafina?" Arthur continued, his lip curling. "At least she appreciates me. At least she sees my value. She understands that I'm more than just some old man waiting to die." Serafina's face contorted with fury as she realized Arthur was destroying their last chance at an alibi. "Arthur, shut up," she hissed. But Leo had heard enough. He turned to the sergeant who was watching this family drama unfold with professional detachment. "Ma'am, sir," the sergeant said, looking between the documents and the two accused. "Is this a family dispute, or do you want to press formal charges?" Leo looked at the woman he had married, the woman who had kissed him goodbye and promised to protect his work. He looked at his father, the man who had taught him to ride a bike and throw a baseball. Then he looked at me. I stood by the door, silent and still. I had done what I needed to do. I had removed the blindfold, exposed the truth, and now the choice was his. Leo took a deep breath, and I watched my son become a man in that moment. "This isn't a family dispute," he said, his voice steady and cold. "This is fraud. This is forgery. This is trespassing with intent to steal." He pointed toward the door with an unwavering hand. "I want them arrested and removed from my property immediately." "Leo, no!" Serafina screamed as an officer grasped her wrist to apply handcuffs. "You can't do this to me. I'm your wife. We can work this out." "Not anymore," Leo said, turning his back on her completely. It was the last thing he would ever say to her. I watched as the police handcuffed Arthur and Serafina with practiced efficiency. Their hands were pulled behind their backs, their wrists locked in cold metal. As they were led toward the door, Arthur turned his head to look at me. His eyes were burning with hatred and recognition. "You knew," he hissed as he passed me. "You set us up, you old witch. This was all a trap." I met his gaze calmly, my face as still as carved stone. "I didn't make you steal, Arthur," I said softly. "And I didn't make you sleep with your son's wife in his own studio." I paused, letting the weight of his failures settle on his shoulders. "I just turned on the lights." He opened his mouth to respond, but the officer pushed him forward toward the waiting patrol car. I watched them being loaded into the back seat like common criminals. Arthur and Serafina separated into different vehicles, their hands cuffed, their heads bowed. The neighbors had gathered at the bottom of the driveway, drawn by the sirens and lights. They watched in shocked silence as the great Arthur Vance was driven away in disgrace. As the beautiful Serafina, beloved wife and successful businesswoman, was exposed as a thief and adulteress. It was a complete and utter humiliation, broadcast to everyone who had ever envied them. I felt no joy in that moment, but I felt no regret either. Only a cold, clear sense of justice finally served. The next several hours passed in a blur of police statements and legal procedures. Leo and I sat in his office with the detective, explaining everything from the beginning. I handed over the email I had photographed on Arthur's computer. We showed them the security footage of the affair and the forgery practice. We gave them the practice sheets, with Leo's forged signature, preserved as evidence. It was all there, every piece of their scheme laid bare for examination. The detective took careful notes, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes widening occasionally. "This is one of the most thorough evidence packages I've ever seen," he admitted. "Your security system captured everything in high definition." When the police finally left, taking boxes of documents with them, the house fell silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears after a storm has passed. Leo sat on the sofa in the studio, his head in his hands. The documents were gone now, but the drafting table was still covered in the residue of betrayal. Champagne stains, glass fragments, the outline of papers that had been removed. I sat down beside him and placed my hand gently on his shoulder. I didn't have words adequate to this moment. What could I possibly say that would make this better? So I just sat with him, letting my presence be enough. After a long moment, Leo leaned into me and began to weep. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He cried for the wife he thought he knew, the partner he thought he could trust. He cried for the father he had idolized since childhood. He cried for the future that had been stolen, the family that had been revealed as a lie. I held him like I had when he was small, when a nightmare or a skinned knee could be soothed by a mother's embrace. But some wounds are too deep for comfort. Some truths are too painful for easy healing. "I'm so sorry, Leo," I whispered into his hair. "I'm so sorry I had to show you this way." He pulled back slightly and looked at me with red, swollen eyes. "No, Mom," he said, his voice raw but certain. "If you hadn't done this, I would have come back and signed anything they put in front of me. I trusted them completely. I would have handed them everything without a second thought." He took my hand and squeezed it, the same way he had when he was a boy afraid of the dark. "You saved me, Mom. You saved everything I've worked for." I held his hand and said nothing. Because, what could I say? I hadn't saved my own marriage. I hadn't saved him from the pain of betrayal. All I had done was expose the rot before it consumed the entire structure. Sometimes that's the best a mother can do. 6 months have passed since that terrible and liberating day. The divorce is final now, signed and sealed and filed with the court. Serafina fought viciously for alimony, for a share of Leo's business, for the house. But the video evidence of her infidelity and attempted fraud destroyed every argument her lawyers made. The judge watched the footage with barely concealed disgust. She left with nothing but her personal belongings and a reputation in ruins. Her career as a business manager is over. No one will trust her now. Arthur is facing criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. His lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence against him is overwhelming. He's living in a small studio apartment across town now, alone and bitter. The last I heard, his own brother refused to take his calls. I received the divorce papers last month, and I signed them without hesitation. 47 years of marriage ended with a pen stroke and a sense of relief. I don't miss him. I miss the man he pretended to be, the one who found flowers in the snow. But that man died a long time ago, and I was just too blind to see his ghost. Leo and I are still living on the property, But things have changed for the better. We sold the cottage where Arthur and I spent our supposed golden years. Too many memories there, all of them now poisoned by knowledge. Leo asked me to move into the main house with him. "It's too big for just one person," he said one evening over dinner. "And besides, I need an interior designer for my new project." I laughed at that, the first genuine laugh I had managed in months. "I'm 73 years old, Leo. I'm retired." "You're the best designer I know," he replied, completely serious. "And you have better instincts than anyone on my staff." So now I'm working again, in a small way, helping Leo reimagine spaces, bringing new life to old structures. We're redesigning the studio together, erasing every trace of what happened there. The cold steel shutters are coming down, replaced by smart glass that shifts from transparent to opaque. The gray concrete walls are being covered with warm wood paneling and living plant walls. It's becoming a space of creation and light, not secrets and shadows. Yesterday, Leo came home from a meeting with a small package in his hands. "I have something for you," he said, that boyish smile finally returning to his face. He opened the box and pulled out something that caught the afternoon light. It was a key, but not like any key I had ever seen. It was made of brass and silver, beautifully crafted, with my initials engraved on the handle. "What is this?" I asked, turning it over in my fingers. "It's the new master key for the studio," Leo said. "Physical access, biometric backup, complete administrator control." He gently closed my fingers around the key. "Permanent," he added, "for as long as you want it." I looked at the key in my hand, feeling its weight, understanding its meaning. It wasn't just about security systems and door locks. It was trust. It was gratitude. It was a son telling his mother that she had earned his complete faith. We walked out onto the terrace together, looking over the garden we had reclaimed. The autumn flowers were blooming, bright spots of color against the green lawn. The air smelled of earth and rain and the promise of renewal. There was no trace of Seraphina's heavy perfume lingering in these halls. No shadow of Arthur's bitter jealousy darkening these rooms. I looked at my son, who was already sketching on his tablet, designing something new. His face was peaceful, focused, full of the creativity that had always defined him. I sipped my tea and smiled. Not a smile of triumph or vindication, a smile of peace, hard-won and deeply felt. The walls I had brought down were necessary destruction. The foundation I had exposed was rotten to the core. But now, on solid ground and honest truth, we were building something that would actually last. So now I have to ask you, after hearing my story, was I wrong to trap them in that room? Should I have confronted them, quietly, and spared my son the public humiliation? Or did they deserve every second of terror inside that steel box? Every moment of exposure? What would you have done if you discovered your husband and daughter-in-law were plotting to destroy your son? Let me know in the comments below. I want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, your judgment. And if this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Until next time, remember this: check your receipts, trust your instincts, and never, ever underestimate the person who holds the keys.